Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Seeing the Big Picture with Program Kanban Boards. Thank you for joining us live. I hope you're doing well and staying healthy. I'm Jesse Bronson, Digital Marketing Manager at Construx, and today I'm joined by Jenny Stuart, Vice President of Consulting at Construx. Jenny oversees Construx's consulting services, where she has helped numerous companies dramatically improve their software development and quality assurance processes. After today's webinar, we'll have a brief Q&A, so be sure to ask your questions throughout the presentation. This webinar will be recorded, and I'll send you guys an email once that is available. I hope you'll also share this webinar with your colleagues who may find today's topic of interest. We really appreciate you sharing that with your network. Jenny, thanks for your time today. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse. I'm glad to be here today and excited to share some thoughts and ideas on being able to visualize and understand the big picture of the workflow in organizations using Kanban program boards. So it'll be a fun and interesting topic, one I actually spend a fair amount of time with multiple different clients on right now. So what we'll cover today is a little bit of the Kanban method fundamentals to help us understand some of the steps that we'll actually go through. We'll talk about what's on a Kanban program level Kanban board typically. We'll go through the steps that I take when I'm talking with people about setting these up to give you some thoughts and ideas and suggestions for the ways you could approach the dialogue in your organization for setting this up yourself. We'll talk about using program Kanban boards to model multiple teams. This is certainly an option. Some people do it, some people don't. I want to expose you to it as a concept that might be of interest. Similar with two-tier Kanban boards, this is the ability to visualize work at a couple different levels in a program Kanban board. And then finally, we'll close with what I use most commonly, which is a concept of multi-level Kanban boards, being able to visualize the work at different levels, of which the program is one of those levels. And please do ask questions throughout. Even though we have a Q&A at the end, it's always good to get those queued up in advance. So a little bit on Kanban method fundamentals. Kanban isn't one way of working. It isn't any one specific life cycle or project management workflow or one specific process, and certainly not just a board. There's more to it. And when I take you through setting up a program Kanban board, you'll get a sense for some of the major things that I think about. Not everything I do when I set up team boards, but the biggest pieces of what I talk to teams about. So that might even be a takeaway. If you're here using Kanban at the team level, there may be some ideas you can apply from this even at your team level. The Kanban method advocates the idea of using a Kanban or a token or a signpost to model the work and to visualize the work and the workflow and put that onto a Kanban board. One of the things I'm constantly talking to people about is the idea of a pull-based system and the idea of limiting how much work is in that system. So we want work not to be pushed downstream to the next stage, but to actually have the work pulled into a stage when there's availability for that work. We also want to limit how much work is in the system at any one time. One of my favorite phrases, stop, starting, start, finishing. Let's not have a ton of things partially done. Let's instead focus more on a smaller number of things we can move across our boards and move from ideation into customer value really quickly. The other nice thing I like about Kanban is it's a way to drive incremental evolutionary change at every level of the organization. So the foundational principles of Kanban are we start with what we do now. So when I model the workflow at the team level or at the program level, we're not going to radically change what the team does today. I want, when we're done designing the Kanban system for a team, for the team to look at it and say, yep, that's how we work. That makes sense. So we start with what we do now, but we recognize that we're going to learn. And we want to pursue evolutionary, incremental, and ongoing change. Never stop, always evolve, always experiment, always learn. and that everybody in the organization, from leadership to the individual contributors, is part of that responsibility to learn, experiment, and evolve the system to make it better over time. The core practices, and again, these can be used at the program level and at the team level, are that we want to visualize. So it's really important we understand what the work is, how that work moves, and we visualize that. That's the Kanban board that most people think about when they think about Kanban. And that's the starting point for Kanban, but by no means the ending point. We also want to talk about how to limit work in process, how to limit how much work is in our system to optimize our flow. We also want to manage the flow. We want to think about things like policies. What's it take to have work considered to be done in a particular stage of the board? Or what kind of work can maybe be expedited through our system? What's it take for us to drop what we're doing now and move to something that is super, super urgent? That shouldn't just be we do it randomly. We want to be very explicit about those kinds of things. We also want to understand things like how do we handle blockers, and that's another way that we would talk about policies. We want to look at our flow data so that we understand how is the flow of our system and is that improving over time as we do our experiments. And then finally, we want to implement some form of feedback mechanism and use that feedback mechanism preferably to experiment over time so that we can constantly be doing an experiment or trying something new and seeing if that improves the flow of our system and improves our ability to deliver value from ideation into our customers' hands. That's really the flow we'll be thinking about as we talk about program Kanban boards. So what's on a program Kanban board? Well, first, it's going to vary a little bit depending on how you've structured your requirements hierarchy. What's the biggest thing you deliver and the smallest thing you work on? Sometimes this will come from the tools. So one example that is pretty common in Jira, if you have the feature plugin, is that your hierarchy will be features is the largest thing, then epics underneath that, and then stories underneath that. If you are in, say, Azure DevOps, you're going to have the opposite requirements hierarchy. You're going to have epics, which have features, which have stories. I often joke with my customers that you could literally call this boulders, rocks, and sand underneath it. Conceptually, it's what's the biggest thing that's flowing across our system, and then what are the smallest things. And here we're going to be talking a little bit more about the epic and feature level, because that's typically what's on the program boards. The other thing I talk to people about a lot to help us understand our flow and make our flow more smooth and predictable is to start thinking about things like how large or small can epics and features be? Can they be all over the board from something that's going to take 6 months to something that will take 10 days? Or should we be thinking about these and trying to get our hands, not that they're all going to be identical, they're never all going to be identical, but sort of what's the min-max that we expect most of these to be in? And once we start getting into understanding the flow of the system, making sure that things are reasonably similarly sized will certainly help the flow be more consistent and more even and smooth. The other thing that we're often talking about is what's independently releasable. Are you releasing stories? Are you maybe feature flagging? You're releasing stories. If the stories have enough value, those actually get turned on and deployed to our customers right away. But that if there's maybe an aggregate of those for an epic, our primary vehicle that we're releasing from our customers' perspectives is epics, even though we're deploying everything into the market. Or are you maybe working on a system that has been around for a long time and has a slower release cadence? And so we're really going to be thinking about what's the incremental things we can be doing to deliver value as we go and maybe demonstrate to our customers through things like perhaps a system demo if you're using SAFe, but are not necessarily going to be immediately deployed and released to our customers right away. I also talk a lot to people about where are the non-functional requirements captured? Are we capturing those across the system? Are we capturing those individually as appropriate for our epics or our features? Will we use the user story format? And where are we going to make sure that we're capturing the custom problem or the benefit statement so that we can start understanding what kinds of things are happening in our system and where will we want to place our model. So a couple examples. I had one customer who said, you know, our highest value delivery, our features, our release cadence today is typically a 6-month release cadence. Features are something that we actually think about as something we would market and release and tout to our customers as being really important. Underneath that, we have epics. There's generally multiple epics underneath the feature. Those demonstrate to us internally as product managers that we have built an element of value towards that feature, but typically isn't independently releasable. We need a little bit more value before we would actually release it as something that our customers could see. But it helps us know when we're halfway through at 3 months, we should have about half of the epics completed for those features that we're working on to make sure that we understand the progress that we have through our body of work we expected to do. Another customer I had was much more fast flow, and they were saying, you know, we generally announce and release our epics. We try and keep our epics pretty short. We want them to typically take no more than a month. If it's bigger than a month, we want to find a smaller piece of value that we can deliver within a month because we very much want to experiment and learn. We always deploy our user stories. Those are generally feature flagged off unless there's some specific reason. And then we announce them, we release them to our customers and flip that feature flag typically at the epic level. So this is going to vary a lot from organization to organization, but I always like to have these conversations with people because I want to know what are we actually going to flow through our program board. And generally we're looking at flowing epics or features, or sometimes we'll actually have multi-level boards here looking at these different levels of abstraction. I want to make sure these are program Kanban boards are the tool I typically use to show how value flows across multiple teams. So it's a big tool in my toolbox for scaling, whether I'm looking at 5 teams and how the value is flowing across those teams, or 25 teams and how the value is flowing across all of those teams. But I will sometimes use these on a single team just so they can have that view of the day-to-day work they're thinking about, but also that bigger picture of ideation to validation with our customers. We want to start at the very beginning of the workflow. So how do ideas arrive? How do features arrive? How do potential solutions arrive? All the way through releasing, deploying, and preferably even into validation, getting feedback that the experiment that we tried actually got us the results we wanted, or we learned that didn't work quite as we wanted and we need to pivot and flow a different epic or feature across the board to do another attempt at getting the results that we expected from that first experiment. Organizations that don't have things like continuous deployment will often see a holding queue in the program board where work kind of piles up waiting for the deployment period. I actually really like to see that. I'll show you an example of that when we go through example boards, because that gives us a real visceral sense of the fact that the opportunity to get this into our customers' hands faster isn't there yet, as we see all these features or epics kind of pile up waiting for that release that happens every 6 months or every 3 months or whenever the planned next release is. So let's go through some examples of setting up program Kanban boards and what kinds of things we should be talking about and thinking about. Work item types is always a big thing. What are we actually delivering? What should we be modeling here? And once we understand that, we'll talk about workflow. When the work item arrives, what happens? What are the activities and the steps and the stages that we're going to do from when it starts until when it's actually done? We'll also talk about stage exit criteria. If you know Scrum's definition of done or definition of ready, it's a very similar animal. How do we clear work in a particular stage to actually be done and ready to be pulled into the next stage? And then finally, we'll talk about WIP limits. And these I talk about both at the team level and at the program level. So for program Kanban boards, this is usually the biggest piece of value that you're flowing across all of your teams that actually has a beginning and has a customer deployment item. So most organizations here, I'm talking about features, epics, or capability that we're flowing across teams, or we're using a safe program increment to actually deliver that into our customers' hands. Once I have the work item types, then I'm really talking about modeling the workflow. So here I'm going to be looking at what are the activities that happen from the start until the end. All right, so now that we know, say, we're modeling epics, what we're going to do is sit down and talk about what's the first thing that happens when an epic arrives or before an epic is created. Is there maybe a set of ideas that are discussed and evaluated before we even create an epic per se? So we'll say, what's the very first thing that happens as an epic is created, or in getting an epic to be created? Once I know that first activity, after that, it's really easy. I just ask, and then what happens? And we just step through, okay, well, we capture the epic in an epic template. We make sure that we understand the business case and the user's need, why this is going to be competitive on our marketplace. And then if it's a good idea, we go forward, we do, say, an initial proof of concept, we do some technical vetting, we do some user journey mapping, and then we reevaluate the epic. And then what happens? And we go through that step until you start to hear things like, well, and then we release it to our customers and we gather telemetry data, or we do user validation with it, or we do a UAT, and then we're done. And that's when you know you're at the end. So once you know what you're modeling and you get that first activity, it usually becomes pretty easy to just do the and then what happens all the way through to understand those activities. You may find in doing this that there may be a couple levels. There's actually a program level and there's a portfolio level, where the portfolio is really managing something at a higher level of abstraction, that once something is decided to be, if you were in safe, say there's an epic from the portfolio that we're really going to start moving on, that would move down into the program backlog and be decomposed into features that then flow through the train. And so you actually want to model these at a couple different levels. So sometimes if you find that things are really bouncing around, you may be talking about two different levels of abstraction, and you want to make sure that you focus on just one. So some example workflows. I had a client once who said, well, we have initiatives, and what happens is a potential initiative arrives, we evaluate that, we may be looking at multiple possible initiatives at the same time, so we're comparing those to decide whether this is a good idea. If it is, then we move into analyzing that, where we take a look at the business case and kind of the MVP that we would need to release to get an idea. Assuming that is all sound, then we implement that. Once it's all implemented, we deploy it and we release it. So now that I have my workflow, then I can just move from that workflow into designing a board. And you should see that the steps that you saw in the workflow look just like the steps that are the stages and columns that are on our board here. So here's our list of possible initiatives. And then we would pull these in and say, we're currently evaluating this one, and perhaps we're analyzing a few of them as well. And we're in the middle of implementation on one, one's done and ready for our deployment. So you'll see this pattern of the workflow maps very distinctly to the columns on the board, which is why I always say you should look at the board and say, yep, that makes sense. That looks exactly like what we do. You'll see that all of these stages have an in process and done column along the way until the last one, and that's because when we're done here, it goes into our done column. Sometimes you'll see that there's actually a couple types of work happening. So I had a client who was primarily doing the initiatives that were coming off of their roadmap. And that was the bulk of their work. But they actually needed a secondary column because every once in a while there'd be kind of a major opportunity to go get a piece of business. And so if that happened and there needed to be some additional work into the system added to support that customer sale, those would show up and actually go on a different swim lane. So sometimes, mostly you'll see program Kanban boards just with one kind of work. That's most of what we'll look at before. But if you really do have radically different kinds of work that need to be managed and they're going to flow across multiple teams, then one place to visualize that and make trade-offs. If you're doing a ton of this work, you're probably moving this work much more slowly for the system. And is that the right balance for the business as we want to run the business today? So having a single place for that is really helpful because it allows you to see the trade-offs that you're making. Another workflow was that we would actually vet our ideas. All right, so another client that I worked with talked through their workflow and said, we take our ideas, we vet those. If we need to, sometimes we'll need to conduct a proof of concept. That might be a technical feasibility proof of concept. It might be a how do we solve the business problem proof of concept, and it might be both of those happening concurrently. Once we've got a feeling that this does make sense, we have the right solution, we understand that it's technically feasible, we move into developing it, then we release it, and then we validate it with our customers. So you shouldn't be at all surprised to see that the board looks very, very similar to that workflow. And you'll see that pattern throughout any time you're doing Kanban is once you understand the workflow, the board just follows that very naturally. Another client that I worked with modeled basically their program level on SAFe and said, well, from a feature perspective, we have our backlog of features. We prepare those features for PI planning, then we conduct our PI planning, then we build those features, they get accepted in the system demos, and then we release those features into our customers' hands at that point. So they have, this one's a little bit interesting because we have our backlog of features, we have the prepare for PI, making sure that those are all ready and they can be brought in and discussed in PI planning. And then you get basically a batch acceptance, because that's what PI planning is it's looking at the program backlog and basically pulling in the set of features the team thinks they can deliver in the next PI. So you basically got a queue here, and then things start to flow again into build, accept, and release, and done. The other thing that I'll sometimes see is that idea of queuing work up for the next release. So here we've got an example of we prepare our epics, we build them, we system test them, and then they sit in a queue for, say, a release that happens once a quarter or once every 6 months. And what you'll see here is a board where you actually have a ready to release queue. And so work will pile up there until the time that you actually start to go through that release process. This assumes that there's some steps, and in this case there usually are. There'll be some steps that actually need to happen. Once you say we're ready to release, we're actually going to do some final activities in that release column to get that out and into our customers' hands, and then that whole batch of epics is going to move into done. They'll move lockstep into release and into done all at the same time. But it's a nice visual that that's how our system is actually running today. Now that we have that view of our work, we have our program Kanban board set up, we want to take the next steps and talk about stage exit criteria. So this is, what does it actually take for us to consider the work to be done in each of the columns or each of the workflow stages? So we might talk about, well, for us, for our features, in the analysis step of our features, we do feature benefit analysis. We use that to complete a feature template. That feature template gets approved by our VP of product management. If appropriate, we'll do preliminary technical feasibility against that feature to make sure that it's both a good idea and something that we can actually do and make sense. And we like to do a very initial user journey and have that reviewed so that we have a good sense for the user experience the feature is going to provide. It's really good, and you'll see there's an example above, to think of this as being cross-disciplinary. So I want to talk about the stage exit criteria, and I want to talk about the activities that are happening from a business perspective. So that's usually represented by product management, but whoever can speak to the business vetting activities that should happen. We want the engineering organization to be thinking about when, where, and how would we need to be doing any technical vetting. And I want the user experience conversations happening at the right place. So we want everybody across the entire organization thinking about these stage exit criteria and collaboratively agreeing what makes sense for us. What do we do today? And sometimes in stage exit criteria, as long as you promise me that from tomorrow forward you'll start doing it, we might even add a step that we've been wanting to do for a long time. And the conversation about the Program Kanban Board is the impetus for us to say, you know, we're just going to start doing that and start doing that now. And I want to support overlapping or parallel work as much as possible. So I'd like to have a simpler set of stages in which multiple things are happening concurrently. So I wouldn't have a business case stage followed by a technical analysis stage followed by a UX stage. If those things can happen in parallel and concurrently, let's have one stage of analysis in which all of those are happening. So here's an example of a board with the stage exit criteria. Here in the vetting stage, we're saying we have a feature, it's in the template that we use, it's been approved, we've done our technical analysis. And for us, we t-shirt size, because if a feature is larger than a large t-shirt size, that's just too big. We take on too much risk with that it may not produce the value we expect. So we're going to find a way to carve off something that's large or smaller to flow through our system to deliver value to our customers. Our proof of concept is the concept's been validated. We have high-level UX guidance available. We don't have everything. We don't need to have every single wireframe for everything related to the feature. We've got that big picture in place. We've also done our high-level architectural review if that was necessary for this feature. In implementation, we consider it to be complete when it's been coded and validated, and we have our help and release notes. And then it goes into a customer validation stage where they run their UAT on it. We address any issues. The users are trained on it, and then it's done. So these should look really different from group to group and organization to organization, even if maybe the column names had some similarity between two organizations. I'd expect the stage exit criteria to look pretty unique because it's the way that organization works today as it moves its features through its system. Next and final thing we'll talk about for designing and setting up a program Kanban board is the idea of WIP limits. Sometimes you'll see that if you talk about how many epics or features does an organization have in flight, you'll hear things like, well, we have 5 teams and 15 features in flight. That's a lot of work in process. So one of the things that we'll want to do eventually, this isn't a starting point, but is to establish WIP limits that really optimize the flow of value here. So for most organizations, we'll run their program board for a little while before they go through and set WIP limits. And our goal for setting those will be to optimize the flow, the continual work of items through the system so that we're getting value delivery from ideation into our customers' hands as quickly as possible by focusing on the smallest amount of work that we should be doing in every stage that moves the work across the board most quickly. Initially, I recommend that you just run the Kanban program board for a little while, look at any bottlenecks that are in the system where work is either starving or stacking up, and also focus on reducing WIP. A lot of times you'll find that if you really take a step back and look at it, and you look at how many teams you have and how many epics or features you have in flight, you recognize that you're spreading those teams across more work than really makes sense. And you'd be able to deliver value to your customers' hands much more quickly by having the teams focus on a smaller set of those features or epics at any one moment in time. The other thing that these boards will sometimes have in the very early stages will be this idea of min-max WIP limits. And a min-max WIP limit basically says, If we reach below a certain threshold, it's time to start doing some additional evaluation. If we aren't evaluating between at least 3 and 6 things, we won't have enough good ideas to feed the next step in the board. But if we've evaluated 6 things across both in process and done, if we have 6 things in that column, then that's more than we need. Evaluating more things is just going to cause us to pile work up here that's going to delay the movement of work through the system. One could eventually, because this is very early in the board, you could actually say, hey, there may be something here. We thought it was a good idea, but something else just showed up that's a really great idea. We're going to take that one. We're going to kind of put it in the trash can. You're pretty early in the flow of value at this point, so that can be a good idea here. It's a really bad idea once you get further into the board. So now that we have the basic Program Kanban board, a couple of different things that you can do with these. One is you can model the boards with multiple teams. So this one shows that we have features flowing across analysis, feasibility, design, and then there's actually a set of component teams. And the feature is going to flow through those component teams to do their part of the feature, starting with the firmware, then the back end, then the runtime system, and then the UI. And once all of the teams have contributed their parts to it, then that feature goes into done and gets ready to be moved into system testing. So if you did have we have a lot of teams who need to participate on this particular piece of work. This kind of view where you can see where it is, you could literally actually have a feature that was kind of sitting on the line between backend and firmware, so you knew those 2 teams were currently working together on it. So I see this really only when you have a pretty strict component team organization and the work really almost goes ka-chunk from one team to the next team to the next team. But if that's what the team is doing today, this is a visual indication of it, and you can start talking about, is that working well? Are we having challenges? Should we be thinking about feature teams? What can we do to kind of optimize the ability of these teams to work together concurrently so we don't have to move a feature from one team to the next team? But it shows a good model of what the organization is doing today to help us understand how that's working, how that's not working, what we might want to do. Another more common example that I see is the idea of a backlog of work where we do some preliminary analysis and then it flows into teams. And so the work will flow, as teams free up, they'll pull something from analysis done into their team column and start doing their implementation and validation of that before it goes into kind of an end-to-end feature testing effort before it gets deployed. So here you can see work flowing through individual different teams and get an understanding for what team is working on what. Another thing that I've seen a fair amount of is 2-tier Kanban boards, and these are boards that actually show you multiple levels of abstraction to the work. So in one board, you might see both the epics and the user stories flowing across the system. So here we see in blue our epics, and Team 1 and Team 2 are just pulling an epic in from done into their queue. So we know that they're going to be working on that together. And then they're going through and taking that epic and decomposing it into the children's stories underneath it. So we can see right now they're refining that. They've got some of it fully refined, some of it they're still working on. The ones that are done are starting to actually be implemented. Some of those are now being closed, and we'll see all those stories move. Once all the stories have moved all the way to closed, the epic can move into the ready for system test column, which is queue, and then it gets system tested, and then it's ready for release. So these kind of boards show you multiple types of work in a single board. And here is an example of it from the wild. The epics or features are in green. The yellow items are the children of that, the user stories underneath that. And don't be too concerned about the orange. A lot of people look at this example and think the orange means that those are all blocked items. Those are just the stickies with the names of the people who are working on it right now. So in the middle, you can see that there's all of the yellow cards showing those user stories, and then at the front of the board and the end of the board, you see the green cards. They're actually the features or epics that were the parents of that work. And we can see there's some WIP limiting happening here. Features are limited by the lanes on the team. Teams can only have one. There's only one spot there for it. And we see our stories within the features over there. My biggest tool in my toolbox is the multi-level Kanban boards. So here I'm looking at Kanban being used at different levels of abstraction. I might have leadership looking at a single program board for a team of 100 that shows the epics, and each team has its own Kanban board showing the product backlog items that they're working on related to that particular epic. So it's really common to say, if you're a peer Kanban organization, you will have typically team Kanbans and then at least a program Kanban board that visualizes the larger workflow above the day-to-day work that the team is doing. And larger organizations may well have the team level, the program level, and a portfolio level as well. So here we're looking at our program board. We can see the work. This one has the teams actually having their own swim lane. We can see that they have a feature in process right now. And if we move down and look at them, we'll actually see they have a board underneath there focused on the user stories that they're moving through, including refining them, developing, testing, documenting them. And they'll move everything underneath that epic through this board. Once everything related to that epic gets all the way to done, then the epic will move on the parent board above it. So we can help out too. I spend a lot of my time training and coaching either on Kanban or Scrum at the team level, and I do a lot of work with people adopting Kanban at the program level to give that greater visibility into the work and the workflow and how they can optimize that workflow. So if we think you can help out, don't feel free to reach out and let us know, and we'd be happy to have a conversation about your situation and what we may be able to do together. And with that, Jesse, I'll hand it over to you for Q&A.
All right, Jenny, thanks very much for the presentation. I'll go ahead and ask a couple of the questions that we got. So one was, do items move from portfolio to program Kanban?
Yes, what you will typically see in any multi-level is that the parent level is going to have a workflow, I guess that's has a longer lifespan. So something flowing through the portfolio level, let's just use the safe terminology and say we have an epic flowing through the program level. That epic's likely to generate multiple features that actually flow through the program Kanban board. Well, that epic is basically staying in sort of the implementation stage. You'll see, say, 10 child features actually flow through the program Kanban board underneath it before that epic. Maybe we say, okay, at that point, we've got enough functionality. This is no longer a portfolio managed epic anymore, and it's now going to move into whatever our next step on our portfolio board is.
Okay, Jenny, here's another question, and it's kind of a general one, but it's, when should Kanban method be used?
So I always don't ask if it should be used, I ask where it should be used. So I do a fair amount of work with organizations that are 100% Kanban, and that's all we're using, but I also do a fair amount where the vast majority of the teams are using Scrum. So one example is all of the feature teams are all using Scrum, but there's a couple teams in an organization, say maybe our tooling team, the team that provides the tooling automation infrastructure that the Scrum teams are using to do their automation work. And we want that team to have a faster cadence than the 2-week sprint cycle. I might put that team on Kanban. Or a lot of organizations will find that Scrum works really, really well for, product delivery, but that production support, especially first line production support, there's just so much change that happens. It's really hard to time box something to 2 weeks there. And so all of the product development teams will be using Scrum, but the supporting teams for production support will be using Kanban. And then, of course, one of the big reasons we're talking today is regardless of whether it's Scrum, Kanban, Scrumban, XP, or anything else at the team level, the second I see multiple teams working together, I'm going to be suggesting that we introduce Kanban at the program level to help us visualize and manage that flow above the teams. So for me, it's just always, where does it fit in this organization? For me, I've always found a place that it makes sense.
Okay, Jenny, here's kind of a follow-up or a very similar question that ties in with that. Are there any situations in which you wouldn't use a program Kanban board?
I suppose if nobody told me they saw any value in having that higher level view, I would be surprised. But, I'm not going to suggest something that doesn't solve a problem the organization feels like they have. I would poke around the edges and make sure they're really sure that there's no need for this bigger picture. But for me, whether it's 2 teams or even 1 team, sometimes I'll work with teams where they really like the idea of, we have got a board for our user stories and a board for our epics, and they give us a different view of our work, and we think about different things at those 2 views. So I've even had places where I use this concept, which I usually think more of as a scaling concept, for a single team. It's that I want that bigger picture understanding that this really sings for.
All right, Jenny, another question here. We are using SAFe. How does this apply in that situation?
Sure. Well, if you go look at the big picture and you go to Essential SAFe and you go look at the program backlog, you'll actually see the word Kanban there. If you scroll down and read through that article, they'll show you a typical Kanban board. But I'm a big advocate in making sure that you've modeled your own workflow that your organization uses. And so while there might be some ideas from SAFe that make sense for you, I would do everything that we just talked through here today with a team, SAFe or not SAFe, to make sure that the program Kanban board made sense for you and it had the right stages, it had the right kinds of work, and it had the right kinds of exit criteria. So this is all very applicable regardless of what kind of work what kind of framework you're using to scale.
All right, the next question is a tool-related question. Would you suggest that a tool like Miro or Mural would be more suitable for these types of boards because of their flexibility rather than the likes of, say, Jira?
I don't know if I have a tool, a dog in the tool fight. Make sure the tool works for you. Make sure you're not doing a ton of rework where you have to go do something inside of both Miro and Jira, and there's a ton of overhead there. All the tools, I think, do a reasonable job at least many of the kinds of boards we looked at. Some of the kinds of boards we looked at today are a little bit harder to do inside of the tools, but use what makes sense for your organization. I've seen a lot of people do this in Jira. I've seen a lot of people do it in Azure DevOps. I'm currently working with an organization using Rally. So if Miro brought something to the table that made it more useful, more visual, easier to keep updated, and didn't add any overhead, by all means.
All right, Jenny. Next one is, do you recommend setting a WIP limit for the IP state of a column and another for the done state of the same column?
No, we want WIP limits that cross both in process and done. Otherwise, done becomes basically kind of an unbounded queue. So we're really trying to optimize value flow, and we want to know, we want to make sure there isn't a stage that's adding more work in the system that slows down our value flow. So I'll just pick on, for example, perhaps we have a bottleneck in system testing, that end-to-end testing of the work of 50 teams, making sure that all hangs together well. And we actually know that if we dump 20 features in there, it takes us 18 weeks to get something out. But if we feed them 10 features in a batch, we can get things out to the door to our customers in 8 weeks. I want to optimize for the flow of value across the whole system. And that's what WIP limiting, both in process and done for every column, gives you.
All right, Jenny, another question. Stage exit criteria can be seen as a checklist and perhaps result in teams falling into stage gate waterfall approach. Is this a concern at all?
It certainly is if you haven't tried to find overlapping and parallel activities. So I'm always looking to see what can we do that's an exit criteria that allows more overlapping work. A big one that I'll often do at the team level is if we have a implementation or a construction column, I'm looking for things like are test cases being written and reviewed as exit criteria for that column. So I want to make sure that we're parallelizing work as much as we possibly can. But yeah, you could certainly establish exit criteria that made work not parallel, not overlapping, and that would be bad.
All right, I'll move on to the next one. Who usually sets up a program Kanban board?
I'll generally do this with a small cross-functional working group. So we'll pull together somebody who represents the business. That's often product management, but not always. I'll want someone who represents engineering. So that's usually an engineering leader. I may have an engineering leader and an architect in the group. I may well have somebody also representing the QA or test organization if that's a separate organization. And then I want somebody representing UX. So we're looking at these are usually small, well, they used to be small working sessions on whiteboards. Now they're virtual working sessions in Mural or Miro or similar kinds of things with typically like 3 to 6 people and me facilitating the conversation.
All right, Jenny, we've actually made it through all of the questions today. So thank you for the presentation, and thanks everyone else for attending and sticking with us through all of the technical hiccups. We're sorry about that, but sometimes things like that are just out of our control. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to me or to any of us here at Construx, and we're happy to see how we can help your teams with Kanban or other software needs. Thank you, Jenny. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse.